So we have our users in our Firebase database. Now we want to give them one or potentially more roles. So I'm going to show you a few different ways to solve this problem. And for each approach, we'll look at the pros and cons. The simplest approach is to add a new property here, like isAdmin, and set it to true. This is the simplest in terms of the implementation. So whenever we get a user object, we can simply access this new property. But this approach doesn't scale well when we want to have multiple roles. For example, let's say in the future, we're going to have another role like store manager. Then we'll have to add another property here, is store manager, like this. Of course, it's not too bad. It's not the end of the world. But you can see as we add new roles in our application, managing this becomes a little bit messy. Another approach is to have a high-level node called roles. And under this node, we're going to have various kinds of roles in our application. For example, we can have admins. And under this node, we can have all the users that have this role. For example, here's my user ID. I'm going to copy this, add this as a node here, and set the value to true. Now in the future, if you want to have another role, we can simply go here, add the store manager role, store managers, and again, we can add a user ID here and set that to true. So if we're going to have multiple roles in our application, you can see this approach scales better. It's cleaner and more maintainable. Now, in more complex domains, even this approach doesn't scale well. For example, you might end up with some conditional statements in your code if the user is part of this role, and part of that role, and part of that role. Then they can perform this operation. In those kind of domains, instead of working with roles, it's better to work with operations. Who can perform what? For example, we can have another node here called operations. Under that, we can have, let's say, create product. And then under that, we can have all the users that can create a product in our application. So we paste the user ID here and set it to true. So with this design, we're managing permissions, not roles. And under this operations, we can have other kind of operations like update product, delete product, who can delete a product, who can ship an order, who can process an order. So this is more specialized. Now, which approach is the best? Well, there is no such a thing as best in software engineering. As I told you before, software engineering is about trade-offs. We can go with this design to make our application extremely scalable. But with that, we're going to increase complexity, especially when working with Firebase, when reading all this data using observables, our code is going to get extremely complex. So I personally always go for simplicity because my goal is to deliver working software within a reasonable time frame. If you want to go build the most flexible software, chances are your application will never make it to the production. And in my opinion, that's an absolute failure because it's not giving value to anyone. You have only satisfied yourself and your curiosity. At the end of the day, you're building software for a business. The purpose of that business is to make money and give some value to the world. So always keep it simple. For this application we are building in this course, we're dealing with a kind of a small organic shop. They don't have various kinds of roles. All they need is an admin. And this is the person who is going to manage the products and the orders in the application. So I'm going to go with the first approach because it's much simpler. Then let's delete roles and operations and also store manager. Now here's a question. Who is going to set this isAdmin property in this user object? Well, we don't want this to happen automatically when the user logs in. Otherwise, everyone who logs in becomes an admin. We want to set this manually. Perhaps when we deploy our application, we're going to create our first user and make them an admin. In the future, if you want to add more admins, we can always come back to this page, find the user object, and set the isAdmin property to true. Now, in a real world scenario where we have thousands or millions of users, finding a user here in the dashboard and setting the isAdmin property to true is going to be difficult. So if your application is at that level, if you have tens of thousands of users, chances are you're going to have a separate dashboard to manage the admins in your application. So we can extend this application, and when the first admin logs in, we can give them the ability to manage the users of our application. They can find the user by their email and give them the admin role. But for now, we don't have to worry about it. So now that we know what users are admins, we are ready to protect the admin routes. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture.